As I said, I'm Marcus, engineering lead at Very Good Ventures. We're a fully globally remote consultancy, and so I work in Billings, actually, but I am an alumni of Montana State. Go Cats! But yeah, live in Billings with my wife and 2 boys there. That's a picture of us at Cloud Next recently, some of the Very Good Ventures team. Since we're all remote, it's weird when we get to meet each other in person. Normally, they're just computer screens, but anyway, today, I'm going to talk about...
I mean, what's the deal with
Flutter?
What's the deal with Flutter, right? Quick show of hands, who here has heard of Flutter? Okay, everyone, that's awesome. Anyone download Flutter, play with it? Has anyone, okay, most of you, or some of you, half of you maybe, has anyone shipped an app to production with Flutter? I see a handful of people. You guys, this may be kind of boring, but for the rest of us, we're going to go through and learn all about what is Flutter, what's the deal. So, I'm going to start out easy mode. I pulled this straight from the Flutter website. What is the deal with Flutter? It's an open source framework by Google for building beautiful, natively compiled, multi-platform applications from a single code base. Okay, so we're building apps here. This is all front end. There's no server rendering component to this. It's only the pretty part of building applications. It's 100% open source. There's no proprietary bits in the entire stack. And you get natively compiled applications, one code base, to a bunch of different platforms. Which platforms? These platforms. iOS, Android, web, Windows, macOS, Linux. There's even some experiments with embedded stuff. You get all this from a single code base, which I think on first face pretty cool, but we've probably heard this before if you've heard of Ionic and Cordova and Xamarin and React Native and Kotlin multi-platform, and even Java's tagline, right, was write once, run anywhere. What makes Flutter think that it can deliver on this? This is probably what you've heard about Flutter, but why can Flutter deliver on it when maybe some of those other ones didn't deliver on it as well as we'd like? And I think to really understand that, you're going to have to bear with me and dive a little bit into how Flutter works, just a little bit, to understand why it's cool. So, we're going to go into the iceberg. Starts out with your code on the top, right? That's the actual bit that you're creating your app. You interact mostly with the Flutter framework. So we call them widgets. There's the base UI component, things like text and images and buttons and switches. All of that is part of this Flutter framework. Also all the gesture detection, scroll views, rows and columns to align stuff, all of that is built into Flutter. It's its own piece, part of the framework. But all that code gets compiled alongside a Flutter engine. It's actually a whole full-blown rendering engine. There's actually 2 of them now, an old one you might have heard called Skia, and then now Impeller is the new one. And this is all written in C++, but it literally is its own rendering engine. And so it actually works kind of like a game engine. If you've ever used Unity or Unreal, where you're painting every single pixel on the screen with that rendering engine, right? We're not mapping to native components, that's how React Native works, right? You're bridging over to actual native iOS and Android components. Here, we're not doing that. We're actually creating them ourselves. There's also Dart, which we'll talk about in a second. That's the programming language. That's also compiled the runtime alongside it. So it's all kind of bundled together with your code. But even that sits upon the actual hardware itself. So everything gets compiled to the chip that your device is actually using. So if it's ARM, if it's x86, if it's web, you can either do JavaScript or now WebAssembly, and it actually runs commands against your GPU. So if you're using Metal on Apple, or you can set up OpenGL on, for other platforms, it actually is native code sending those commands directly to the GPU. So that's why you have native performance. It's actual machine code for your chip, and that's what your app is. It's not a web wrapper or something like that. But then since you also control every pixel, you can do anything, right? You can even write custom shaders that control exactly how your app looks if you want. Of course, you don't have to do that, but you have complete control. I did want to talk a little bit about Dart. Sorry, this is going to be the text-heavy slide here, but just some things about Dart. It is an object-oriented language. It's a strongly typed language, but it has lots of good type inference, and so you don't have to specify types everywhere. It has sound null safety, which is really cool. It means at compile time, your code is null safe, and so there's a lot of optimizations that you can make in the binary because you don't have to do null checks in that code. Also, you basically can't have a null pointer exception in Dart, which is super cool. It is a garbage collected language. I know for some people that's great, and some people hate that. Your mileage may vary on that, but I've never had an issue with it in Flutter. Has a C-like syntax, which we'll see in a second. I like to joke it's kind of like Java and JavaScript had a baby, is how it feels to code. There's also higher order function support. So like list mapping, lists, filters, all that you'd be used to in JavaScript is in there. And a lot of syntactic sugar, like a lot of the things that we like to use, ternary operators and spread operators, null-aware operators, kind of all that stuff that in a modern language you'd kind of expect. Dart has all that. The other cool thing about Dart is there's a ton of compilers. So this is actually why Flutter chose Dart, is because there's a lot of things that you can compile it to. So like I said, x86 or ARM, WebAssembly. There's actually 2 JavaScript compiler transpilers, one for production and then one for debug, so that you get like better symbols on debug mode. And the whole point, that's basically why Flutter chose Dart. One of the reasons is that you can send to all the different platforms, right? If you're a multi-platform framework, that's important. It also can compile ahead of time for those efficient binaries that we were talking about, and just in time. So we're gonna see in a second the demo with a really cool feature called hot reload, and it's all powered because you can actually just recompile bits of your code just in time as you need it. So for debugging, it's super important, but then you can do an actual build ahead of time and get the native performance. So I really like Dart. It's kind of weird, like not a lot of people are coding in Dart outside of Flutter, but I think if you've used any language in the last 10 years, Dart will be super easy to pick up. So let's see some Flutter code. I'm gonna go to a little demo here. So this is the counter app. This is if you build a new Flutter app, like you install the CLI and everything, and you get Flutter new, you'll get this app. It's real simple. It just counts how many times you click this button. But I'm gonna use it to show you what the code is here. It's an object-oriented language, so we have a class like you'd expect. You'll see it's extending stateless widget. So I said everything's widget, it's the base UI component. So like this whole app is actually a widget. And then you can see it's composed of other widgets. So it has a my homepage, which is itself. This is a stateful widget, but it's still just a type of widget. And then if we find every widget has a build method, which returns just a widget. I said widget about 30 times there, but that's basically how this framework works. Inside of it, you can see we have an app bar, we have a column that aligns things vertically here, and you can see we have like our 2 text widgets. I mentioned it's 100% open source, so I can just command click in here, see how text is defined. So this is like in the actual Flutter framework itself. You can see it's also just a stateless widget, but it's cool. So if you're ever troubleshooting something in the framework that like isn't working the way you'd expect, you can just go and see how it's implemented super easy in your IDE. It literally is open source all the way down to like the engine's all open source. You can see what GPU calls get made. It's 100% open source. And then, so I was talking about hot reload. I want to show you that. So for example, I'm going to scroll back up here. You see we have our theme here is this blue color. Let's say I decide I want to make it red instead. All I have to do is save, and it's instantly, like within milliseconds, updated. I'll say I've worked on Flutter apps that are millions of lines of code, and it's still that fast because it's smart and knows how to rebuild only the pieces it needs to like make your updates make sense, like to be in sync. And so if you've ever done like native development with iOS or Android, you have to recompile everything from scratch if you want to actually use your app. Because I should say, this is a real running production app. This isn't like an emulation or something. This is the code that will ship when you release this app, and it can just change just like that. But it's more than colors. You can literally change kind of anything. You can change this text. You push this many times, maybe a bunch of exclamation points, and it updates. You can even change, I don't know, we could be here all day, right? You can totally rearrange your app, add widgets, remove them. You also notice it's a stateful hot reload because this 7 is still here, and even if I change it up, it still keeps that variable. So everything stays in memory, and it only changes like the bit that you changed. So when you're actually developing, that's really how you develop in Flutter. You're kind of going back and forth, make a change, see how it affected, and it's like this feedback loop that makes it really efficient to develop in. Just a quick note on like how the state management, the basic stuff works. It's a reactive framework, just like React or Vue, or kind of if you're familiar with any of those. You'll see for my homepage, it actually has a state object tied to it, so we create that state. And in there, we just have a property on the class, counter, started at 0, and then we have this increment counter function, which is called on this button press here. So hopefully that looks super familiar to all of you. And basically, this function just increments the counter and then wraps it in this set state function, which basically tells the Flutter engine, hey, whatever happened in this closure, change the state, we need to rebuild. And of course, there's debugger support and things like you'd expect. So if I drop a breakpoint, try to increment this, you get kind of what you'd expect from a modern debugging experience. It's all kind of built into Flutter. So that's Flutter. That's super quick, but that's kind of what it looks like when you're developing Flutter. So now, often, maybe you're thinking, this seems cool, maybe I need to check this out, but I have a lot of questions. I wanted to preempt a bunch of common questions. So, can it? Let's see. Well, I rearranged the slide, so that didn't make sense. But are there packages like npm create? There is. It's called pub.dev. We joke Flutter developers spend way too much time at the pub, and that's where there's tons of open source stuff from Google, from the actual Flutter team, but also just everyone else. There's a huge community of open source packages for doing common tasks and kind of other widgets, whatever you need. It's kind of like what you'd expect on other platforms. Can you use native APIs like GPS and stuff? Absolutely. There's kind of a bridging framework that it has between the Dart layer and like native layers. You can write like Swift code or Kotlin or whatever you want and basically pass messages back and forth, which is pretty cool. Like anything you can do in a native app, you can do in Flutter. Sometimes if it's really on device, you just have to write a little extra code. I'll say for stuff like GPS or accelerometer and stuff, there's packages for that. People have already done the work that are really good. So, but if you have something special, absolutely, you can still use it. Can I make it look like a native app? Yes, you can, with an asterisk, right? We're shipping the whole Flutter engine, so we can't use native iOS components, for example. But what there is a library that ships with Flutter called Cupertino, to avoid trademark infringement, I believe. And basically, it has widgets that are built in Flutter, but they look like iOS components. And there's also one Material, which is for like Android, and there's lots of other open source ones for any platform that you kind of expect. So you do have to make it look like a native app, but because you're actually like painting every pixel, but you can still do that if you'd like to. Does it bloat my app size? I hope some of you are thinking this, because you're like, hold on, we're shipping a whole rendering engine alongside the app. Why? Like, that's got to add a lot of stuff. And the answer is, yeah, it kind of does, frankly. Like that example app I showed you, if you compile it to an APK, it's about 20 megs, which is more, you know, if you're really sensitive to your app to like bundle size. For example, instant apps, which is something on, I think Android and iOS both have a version of it. You can't really do that with Flutter because they have to be under 10 megs, and the actual base engine is more than that. So just something to keep in mind. In practice, I've never seen it be an issue for any of the clients that we've worked with. Generally, most of the app size is your app. It's not actually the engine, especially as it scales like a real-world app. So something to keep in mind, though. What IDE should I use? I was using VS Code in that demo, which totally works. It's probably the most common one people use. But you can use Android Studio, is also fully supported and common. But there is a language like server protocol or protocol server or whatever. So you can connect it to anything. I've seen NeoVim and Zed and all sorts of stuff. So you can use it with your favorite IDE if you would like. Can you do unit and integration testing? There's actually a framework built into Flutter for doing this testing. So it's cool, everyone uses the same one. It's different than like the web world where there's a bunch of different ways to test your app. And because everyone uses the same one, like the examples that you find online, there's just lots of good content if you're confused or stuck on something. We actually at Very Good Ventures enforce 100% code coverage on every project that we do. So if you ever go to our blogs, we'll never shut up about unit testing. It's well supported. And finally, do I have to rewrite my app completely? You don't have to. There is a system called Add to App. So imagine if you have an Android and an iOS app that are native, and you have one screen that you want to add to both, then you can actually create that one screen in Flutter and then stitch it into your native app kind of seamlessly so your users wouldn't know that it's a Flutter app, or a Flutter page, I guess, in that sense. And we've actually used this with different clients to adopt Flutter over time. So instead of just completely starting from scratch, let's just try this out and step in our toes in a little bit and gradually adopt it over time. But I think the biggest question, elephant in the room maybe, Why should I trust it? I know there's about 6 of you I saw that as soon as I said it's open source from Google, you're like, I'm out. Like, they're going to kill it by the end of the sentence, probably. But, so yeah, it's a good question, though. I think it's something that if you're thinking about Flutter, you should be thinking about this. For what it's worth, Google uses it a ton. That's like why they built it, is to build their own apps. These are just a few of them that they've built. They've like migrated to Flutter, things like Google Pay, Google Analytics, Classroom, Google Earth, the YouTube Creator app. Also, that little triangle one is the Google Ads app. So you can actually like buy Google Ads with a Flutter app, which is probably in Google's interest to keep around. So it gives me confidence that it would be expensive for Google to kill Flutter because they'd have to rewrite all these apps and more. So that's something. And then also, for what it's worth, a huge community has started to adopt Flutter. Lots of big brands. I'm not going to read them all. One I did specifically want to call out is Toyota, because they're actually rewriting their whole infotainment system in Flutter. So like maps and music and stuff that goes in the screens in their cars. Hopefully next year, we'll start seeing cars shipping with that version. I know about that because I got to work on that project, actually. It's super cool. It's like a different use case for Flutter than just the standard iOS, Android, but they're all in on that. It's like 100 developers working on it. It's a huge project. But, oh, sorry, I did just want to go. It's not just a wall of logos. I wanted to show you some apps that have been built in Flutter just to build confidence, I guess. I don't know. IBM was one of, or sorry, not IBM, BMW, lots of acronyms, was one of the first companies to go in with Flutter. That's like their car companion app. Betterment is on the far left. They're like a bank that they rewrote their app in Flutter. They're actually one of them that has incrementally adopted it. So they started with just a few pages, and now it's 100% just Betterment. And the middle one, that's the musical Hamilton. They were one of the first people to build an app with Flutter. It's like a companion app to the show. So there's lots of games and other content, and you can, I think, enter lottery system for tickets through it. That one's cool because, yeah, it was 2017, I believe, by Very Good Ventures, actually, long before I was there. But it was the first like real production app. They're still using Flutter, it's still going well for them. So just to give you an idea, you can make real stuff with Flutter. But I did want to talk about app development in general. Like, why does this all matter? Are there app developers here, like people that work on Android, iOS? A few of you. This should look super familiar to the traditional way, right? Someone creates a great design, your designers build something beautiful, and then they hand it to these different teams and say, hey, teams, make it happen on Android and iOS and web, right? And then these different teams who have completely different technology stacks, they can't really work between each other, have to build the thing and make it look as close as they can to the design with completely different tools on completely different schedules. So that means you need a lot of like PMs to organize everything and make sure you're tracking toward a release that's consistent. And also, by the way, there's a back-end team that's also trying to work with all these companies to get everything working on all these different platforms consistently. And it's just a lot of overhead. You need a bunch of different teams, a bunch of like management costs just to keep everything going because there's a lot of people involved in a lot of different kind of priorities. In the Flutter world, it's a lot different. You just have one Flutter team that talks to the designers. And you'll notice I put 2 arrows there because since it's such a smaller, more condensed, efficient team, often, and stuff like hot reload honestly speeds up development a ton, you can kind of work back and forth with your designers, right? There's like before, if the iOS team said, hey, we'd like to update the design in this way, it'd have to go back to the designers and then they'd have to agree with the Android and the web people or whatever platforms you're doing. Here, it's just one team, so you can be really efficient and like iterate your designs a lot faster. Same with the cloud team. You're working just one team with another team, so you can iterate a lot quicker between them. And really, I think this is the part you should care about the most of all of this, is that with Flutter, it honestly reminds me a lot of what Ryan was talking about earlier, that we don't have to think about which technology we're using, right? The technology doesn't matter so much. It kind of pulls away. It's just one app team building one app that just happens to deploy to all these different places. It means that you can just focus on building value, right? Focus on the product and actually delivering what you want to, and you don't have to think about what the technology itself is, right? Flutter really enables you to just build stuff, which I think is probably the goal for all of us in this room. So, thank you. And I will say, if you want to learn more, come find me, Flutter.dev is all about Flutter, and if you want to know about Very Good Ventures, of course, you can always find that on the web too. But yeah, thanks.